Our next speaker is Reg Larkin, and again, if you want to look at the complete bio, I see some of you have it opened and are reading it right now as I speak. He's got a really interesting background, and he's been a counselor for close to 30 years or more, and he has a church in Bastrop, Texas. He's been doing that for the last 10 years. So his presentation is going to be on faith, celebration, and grief in caregiving. Would you help me welcome Reg to the stage?
It's very good to be here. Can you hear me by any chance? Yeah. Okay. Just to give you a little bit about me personally, a little more personal than just the career history. Been married for 39 years. Have a wonderful 31-year-old daughter, and I have a flock of brothers and related relatives that all live in the far frigid north, and of course come to visit us in Texas. And let's see what else. My dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when he was about 82, 83, and died at 87. So we went through about 4 years, might have been closer to 5 years of dealing with that at a personal level. And as we look at these things together, one of the things I'm always aware of is I am confident that there are folks in this gathering who could stand up, and every portion of what I'm going to do, there's somebody here who could do that portion better out of your life experience, out of the wisdom you've gathered, out of the things you've dealt with. So hopefully we're sharing things here that will be valuable for everybody. And one of the first things you can see on your handout, I have listed the Constellation of grief and loss. And way back in the late 60s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did pretty extensive studies on grief and dealing with loss related to death. And yet her work has then been extrapolated and applied to so many different areas of loss in life. And she had the 5 basic stages, first one being denial, then anger, then bargaining, then sadness, and then finally acceptance. And as you can see on your handout, I've modified that a little bit, because with the anger, I've also included fear. So I'm not trying to rewrite her studies. I'm just simply adding things that from the counseling perspective, I see real frequently as a part of this picture. That when we're dealing with loss, whether it's the loss through death, whether we're dealing with the loss of someone in an ongoing way like Alzheimer's, that along with anger, very often there is a sense of fear. There can be a fear. In fact, this is a realistic concern. My brothers and I, as soon as my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you know what we had to start talking about? We had to start saying, I wonder if any of us are going to be dealing with Alzheimer's in the future. And so there will be some degree of realistic concern that can easily turn into fear. There can be fear about what it means for the future. So along with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages, which I'll say more about, I would add that one consideration of fear as well. I would also expand on the idea of acceptance. And part of this, I really believe, is because of the population I've worked with. So as a counselor, one of the ways I genuinely think about it is I get to work with really wonderful people at really hard moments of their life. And one of the things that I would add to acceptance that I hope you incorporate with expectation and decision and planning is that we get to go way past simple acceptance to celebration. We get to go past that to treasuring. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but that we don't just settle for, in a sense, a cold, dry acceptance. We're going to take that further and deeper. And then to the right, you'll see there Caregivers' Constellation of Experiences, which is a little different than the stages of grief, because I think these are things that most of us in the process of caring for somebody over an extended period of time will very naturally go through. So most of you, and I'm not even going to say all of you, most of you entered, if you are active in someone's care, if you're active in supervising their care or directly providing their care, begin with some initial commitment of compassion. And yet one of the things that you know and that I think has already been sort of touched on today is the recognition that when you're caring for somebody with Alzheimer's, it's not a clean, focused grief. It's not a clean, focused resolution. It can stretch on for years. And so that constellation of grief we just talked about may be something that you go in and out of and in and out of. And they were originally called stages, and I think almost everybody in the caregiving perspective now recognizes we can't call them stages. Stages makes it sound like there's stage 1, then you finish that, and you go to stage 2, and you finish, and you go to stage 3. Grief does not work that way. That there are some people that go straight into anger. There are some people, in fact, that go straight to acceptance in a very healthy and realistic way because of the necessity of the situation. And then later, they go to sadness, and later they go to anger. And maybe even years later, they go through periods of denial. So this is not a logical process. It's not a stage, step 1, step 2 process. This is something we weave in and out of depending on circumstances and resources and just where our life is at. And the same with these other experiences, that you may begin with compassion, but as you keep taking care of this person through months and then through years, that compassion can be eroded. The emotional component of compassion can be eroded by just weariness, just exhaustion. And that recognition, I didn't say anything about it because I was waiting for this moment, is that along with those phases of grief, I would add also guilt. Because very often the folks I'm dealing with who are either helping somebody or have helped somebody or pouring their life into helping somebody with some kind of extended care situation, any type of dementia, even a long-term physical problem, end up exhausted and weary. And then they feel guilty that they want to quit. And they feel exhausted, physically exhausted, and that can end up leading to just emotional numbness, where you can wake up in the morning and go, I don't care. This morning, I don't want to care for Dad. This morning, I don't want to go see how Mom's doing. And then again, guilt can flow from that recognition that right now I'm not feeling or sounding or looking very compassionate. And so I've got to deal with that myself in terms of how do I get back to that compassion, or do I even need that compassion? With that exhaustion, with that emotional numbness, and with the guilt that flows from that, we can end up isolating ourselves, just being overwhelmed. In fact, I am confident, I don't even need to ask for a show of hands, but I will. All of you who are either helping care for somebody or at least are very heavily involved in the management of that care, how many of you would say that once you got deeply pulled into this process, many of your other connections and relationships started shrinking a little bit? Some of your other connections started getting harder to make time for. So if you face that, go ahead and raise your hands. Okay, quite a few hands going up. That's normal. And then if you're actually really emotionally and physically depleted, and most of us tend to do this, you sort of batten down the hatches and you focus on what has to be done. What's the minimum I need to do to get through this day? And taking care of yourself and taking care of healthy people who still are in your life and need some measure of care gets harder and harder. And then that real abstract thing of going and taking care of a friendship can be one of the things that suffers. So we tend, when we're going through extended long-term care for someone else's well-being, to have to face this challenge of I either isolate myself or I find creative ways to keep reconnecting with people. So if you look through that constellation of experiences, another one is despair, because every now and then it can feel really hopeless. And here's part of it. If I was sick and you came to my house and took care of me, and we both were saying, wow, at least in 3 months, I'm going to be better. We'd be encouraged. And we'd look for the signs of my improvement. Oh, I'm breathing a little better, or I'm walking a little bit better. And with long-term care for an Alzheimer's or dementia patient, we're not looking at improvement. We're expecting, and periodically we will encounter the continuing evidence of deterioration. And so that recognition that grief gets to keep happening at deeper and deeper and deeper stages of loss. That today I've lost more in this relationship than I realized I'd lost a month ago or a year ago. And now I've got to deal with that again. And we'll talk about that, of how I go from despair back to some sense of hope, to some sense of purpose. And in terms of this loss, you'll see the next section down there is just multiple layers of loss. And again, many of you could add to this list. So I've, just out of my own experience and working with other people, some of those layers of loss, obviously, by the very nature of what we're talking about, to a certain extent, we're now losing the treasure of the past with this person. And I can remember when I would be visiting my dad and spending time with him. I live here in Texas, obviously, and my dad was at a care facility in Chicago, so about once a month I'd go up and spend a few days with him. And through those months and through those years, more and more it was getting to the point where he didn't remember me, or he didn't remember big chunks. I was sharing with somebody earlier, there would be times where on the same day, I'd walk in the room and he'd be, "Son, good to see you." And we'd have a good conversation. I'd walk out of the room. 5 minutes later, I come back, and he says, "Sir, I just want you to let you know that I had a wonderful visit with my son a few minutes ago." And where it was clear he's losing the connection, he's losing the recognition, and eventually that loss was almost complete. Where I was this pleasant gentleman that he liked visiting with, but it was harder and harder for him to make any connection to the past. We had lost the past together. And in fact, for most of us, shared past is a big part of the treasure of any relationship. Shared past is a part of how we define ourselves and our identity and our place, our role in that relationship is all the things. My 3 brothers and I were all in our 60s and right around there. And our wives like to sit at the other end of the room and watch the 4 of us while every time we get together, we reminisce. You need to know this. Well, actually, you don't need to know this. You get to know this. Most of the stories of our memories are really stupid things we did when we were young and foolish. Now we're old and foolish, but we can tell those stories. And it's part of our love relationship. It's part of our sharing. It's part of our sense of place in the role and the identity of that relationship. And that's one of the layers that's lost, is we lose the past. We also lose the future. We start losing what connects us to hopes and dreams that we can share with this person. And out of both of those, losing the past, losing the hopes and dreams and plans of the future, the bottom line is we are losing relationship. And even if you are a person who can feel strong compassion, even while you're losing all those connections, it's a one-way compassion very often. Not always. Again, nothing here is always. It's so many individual variations. But you're losing the relationship because now you often are just that caring person, or that obnoxious person, or the invasive, controlling whatever who comes in, but the relationship has been lost. Also have there that your identity and role. If you've thought of yourself as this person's son, this person's daughter, their husband, their wife, their granddaughter, you've thought of yourself and experienced yourself in a role, and now that role is being lost layer by layer, month by month, year by year. So most of you who are involved in these at a personal level are experiencing all these layers of loss, where you're losing time, energy, and options for your life. while you're involved heavily in caring for somebody else, there's a lot of things that are no longer on your agenda. There's a lot of things that you just push off to the side because you recognize, I don't have the time for that. And so your world shrinks in many ways. Your options shrink. And then out of that recognition, resources shrink. How many here haven't spent a penny on taking care of the one you love? You might even ask for a show of hands. Very often, this becomes one of the largest financial losses a family faces. Several families I've worked with through the years that could say, this is the most expensive thing we've ever done, is to care for mom or dad or grandma through this extended loss where they can no longer take care of themselves, they can no longer function, they can no longer get where they need to go. Now it's all up to us. And as things become more dangerous, I remember the first time, some of you will have the same story, almost exactly the same story. We knew it was time, or we were hit with the recognition it was time for my dad to be in a care facility when he started a fire in his kitchen. And he couldn't even comprehend how the fire started. The firemen could tell how the fire started, but my dad could not comprehend how that fire started. And just cooking something, and then not watching it and forgetting it, or leaving a burner going right next to a curtain. That simple things that we would expect a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, and now this highly functioning, highly respected adult, highly independent, is now at a point where they need supervision and they can't take care of that. And all time, energy, and resources can get sucked into that. Now, what I really want to focus on for the time we have left is strategies. So if you'll look at the bottom, strategies for a healthier grief and a healthier caregiver. And again, I know the things we just covered, that constellation of grief, the constellation of things you go through and experience, and even the layers of loss. If we had time, I am confident that some of you could add valuable aspects to that I didn't even cover. But let's look for a few moments at how we move toward a healthier acceptance. Now, I'm going to do a couple of things out of order, because way down the list, I say this, next to last. Decide that some improvement is better than an all or nothing mindset. And the reason I want to start with that is because I know what we do. And by we, I mean human beings. Somebody suggests something that would improve my situation, and it's real easy that I start thinking of the 13 reasons why your suggestion is really stupid and won't work in my life. Or why I tried it once and it already didn't work, so I'm not going to waste my time trying it again. So one thing I do really want to encourage you is that you decide a little improvement is better than nothing. So that rather than think, well, since I can't aim this high, I'm not going to do it at all. One of the things I really encourage you to do is be creative, be thoughtful, be prayerful, get your hands into the challenge of how would I improve this area even a little bit. Because if I'm improving 2 or 3 or 4 things even a little bit, my experience will probably improve a significant bit, just by the accumulative value of those efforts. I'm also using the word you'll see several times, decide. The reason I'm adding that is, as a counselor, I work with a lot of people in a lot of different situations. This is just one of the situations that has been coming up more and more over the last 15, 20 years. But I work with folks in a lot of different situations, and somebody will come in and we will cover strategies to work on and improve their situation. We'll look at things that they could go right out and do. And then they come back in next week, and sometimes the week after that, and the week after that, and the week after that, and they still haven't done any of those things. And very often I'll hear some variation of this. Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea. I know it's a good idea. I should do that. But what hasn't happened yet is a decision. So that's what I'm asking you to consider for each of the things we're looking at, is that you would consider, is there some wiggle room? Is there some improvement room in this? Then I'm going to make a decision to take action to improve it just that little bit. I would even encourage you, start with the decision, because until then you might not even find the wiggle room. Until you've decided to make the improvement, you might not see the room for improvement. So looking at a few of these things, in some ways I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because you guys are here. So you're already aware of some of these things. But one of the first things I really try to encourage somebody is, first, accept your feelings as normal. Accept your experiences as normal. And I'm going to try to define normal larger than because that's what Bob is feeling or that's what Susie is feeling. That what you're feeling as you go through this is just the reality of what you're feeling. I've worked with people who have lost a child that they deeply loved. And now we can say 2 years after the fact, there's some of those aspects of grief they've never experienced. And where I've worked closely enough with them to say, then you're just that other person. You're the 3%. You're the one who won't go through anger. You're the one who won't go through guilt. So everybody doesn't have to experience everything. But it begins with you deciding, but I'm not going to deny or hide from myself what I'm feeling. I'm going to accept it as a legitimate thing. But then I suggest this. I really strongly suggest this. And again, you're here. Find a way and a place where you can share those feelings, share those experiences, share your frustration, share your anger, share your anguish, share your sadness, share your ridiculous, funny stories that you would be afraid to tell somebody because they might think you don't respect your mom or your dad or whoever again. My dad, I have to tell you this, my dad called me up at about 1 o'clock in the morning once. And he said, Reg, my phone's not working. So I said, well, what's wrong, Dad? And my brother had set up the phone so that it had 4 buttons. And each button called a different brother. And he said, Dad, you don't even need to think about it. Just push one of these buttons. And one of us will be there. And the names were right beside it. So he knew he'd called me. He must have read it, and it said Reg, and he called. And we had an extended conversation trying to figure out, so Dad, what's wrong with the phone? Well, I pushed the button and it won't work, okay? I guess that means you tried calling one of the other guys. And he goes, well, maybe. And we went round and round to figure it out. And quite a ways into this conversation, my dad goes, oh, I figured it out. And I said, so what's the problem, Dad? He says, well, I opened it up and I see the problem. You opened it up? He says, yeah, there's no ink. So my dad was up at 1 o'clock in the morning trying to write something, and his pen didn't work, but he had to look at a phone, and Jennifer, I think, already covered this or touched on this. He looked at a phone, and he called me to ask how to fix his pen, but he was looking at a phone. So that was the word that came to his mind. My phone's not working. Now, I promise you, I love my dad, and I respected him a great deal, and my brothers and I still laugh about that 10, 15 years later. You should tell somebody that story. I mean, your version of that story. You can tell them my story too, but it won't be as good. Tell your own stories. And that recognition that you share it with somebody does a couple of things. One is it actually expands what you gain from your experiences. And it gives validity and value to what you're feeling and when you're experiencing, to just share it with somebody else. Choose someone you trust. Choose someone you love. Find a support group. But I would actually encourage you, don't just find a support group. Find a support group, absolutely. But find somebody that you could just bother at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and go, boy, am I frustrated. Boy, do I want to quit right now. And where you know they're not going to freak out. They're going to let you say what you need to say, feel what you're feeling. Talk the way you want to talk, and they're still going to love you, they're going to care about you, they're going to respect you after the conversation's over. Now, I'm also encouraging this. Decide to accept the fluctuating processes and repetitions of grief. And again, that you're deciding, I don't have to do it a certain way. that not only are my feelings valid, but they're valid even if they're different than what I expected or different than what somebody else expected. I read a piece of research recently that was talking about the fact that so many counselors were so embedded in the grief process that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had laid out, that now they were, in a sense, pressuring people to go through all 5 stages. Literally, pressuring people to go through it. And that even in our culture as a whole, if a widow loved her husband, grieved over her husband, said goodbye to her husband, and then 9 months later, she's falling in love with another gentleman, that now everybody's assumed, well, you must be in denial. Why? Well, because I read this book that says you should still be grieving. Everybody's different. So the core of this is accept all those fluctuating processes on the foundation that you're going to be honest with yourself. You're not trying to copy, you're not trying to be the book. And you're not hiding it even from yourself. You're sharing it with yourself, and then you're sharing it with somebody else. I'm also encouraging you to recognize this, that along with the fact that caring for someone, I'm going to combine a couple of things here, that loving and caring for someone has great value even if they're not fully aware of your care. Because that's embedded in the Alzheimer's process. That's embedded in the dementia process. Is that more and more you're going to be caring for somebody who's less and less aware or less and less processing the depth and the reality and the cost of your care. So you're going to have a higher sense of value and purpose to it than they say thank you because they get it. Some of you are caring for folks. My dad was actually a pretty mellow gentleman in his final years, except at night. And at night he was combative. And I think part of it was as at night he was confused. And at night they would come in and take his clothes away for laundry. But I got numerous phone calls at 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning because a thief had broken into his house to steal his clothing. And he wanted to get up and stop them. He wanted to get up and fight them. So that recognition that they're no longer processing accurately means you cannot count on their appreciation and their awareness to make your efforts valuable. Now, part of it for me as a pastor and a Christian counselor is I want to aim higher for this. Because one of the things that in Matthew 6, Jesus says, I'm not going to start preaching a whole sermon, but one of the things that Jesus says in Matthew 6 is, when you're doing something, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. Don't worry about who you got the applause from. That your heavenly Father who sees in secret, He'll know that you did it. And so for your own value of your character, for you to be able to define yourself as, I am living out my commitment to be a caring friend, a caring son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter, or a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law. I'm living out that commitment, and that's good about my character. I don't need to go toot my own horn. I don't need to make sure somebody else applauds for me. I get to know that. That's good in my character. But I also get to know this, that my Heavenly Father who's actually seeing this is saying what He actually says, He will say one day, well done. And for those of you who are believers, I would encourage you that you actually have that father-son, father-daughter conversation of, Father, I need to remember that you treasure what I offer. Even if it doesn't pay off, even if nobody else notices, and nobody else appreciates it, particularly the person I'm caring for, I want to remember that in your eyes, well done. This is well done. So that we gather treasure and meaning out of that. Another thing I want to encourage you is that you're deciding that your life has purpose and value, has a destiny, has a design outside of caregiving. And this blends into several things. In your handout, you have somewhere in there, you have a one another list. And all I did for that list is I just went through the New Testament and I tried to find all the passages, and I'm sure I didn't get all of them, but I got most of them. All the passages that are one another passages, that are together passages or with each other passages. And I would encourage you to recognize all of those are God's design for you outside this one caring relationship. That you're still designed to be in relationships where you care for one another, where you pray for one another, where you carry one another's burdens. You're still designed for relationships where you encourage one another. So all of those one another's, I would encourage you, in fact, to look at that list on your own time. Don't stop listening. Look at that list with the challenge in mind of, do I have at least one relationship where I'm doing each one of these? Now, I would say, just realistically, there's almost no way in the world to do that whole list in a single relationship. I would never go to my wife and say, sweetheart, read the list, because I'm expecting all of that from you. Because she could probably go through that list and circle and go, not this one, not this. You know, it doesn't all have to be one relationship. But that you're recognizing God, the designer, is telling us in the Word, here's your design. Keep looking for relationships. And even if you're thinking, I am swamped, how do I go build another relationship? Or how do this relationship I had that used to have some of these things is now so distant, and I've taken such poor care of that relationship. Again, just prayerfully, thoughtfully consider, is there a way for me to re-engage and go deeper into some of these relationships so that more of my design is being lived out, more of my design is being satisfied? I also put down here, I'm going to probably skip a couple of these for time. Decide to forgive and to accept forgiveness. Now, again, I've been doing counseling pretty much full-time for about 30 years. And I think I can say this very, very genuinely. That of everything we go through in counseling, in all kinds of situations, marriage, family, caring for someone, depression, anxiety, it doesn't matter what it is, it amazes me, but it seems to be really true, that forgiveness is probably one of the most significant, one of the most essential qualities to our emotional, spiritual, physical relationship well-being. Learning to receive forgiveness and then learning to give forgiveness. Now, I put a handout there with it as well that's called exactly that. Learning to grow in receiving and giving forgiveness. Now, there are several passages in the New Testament that tie those two forgivenesses together. Almost every time, every significant passage about forgiveness in the New Testament puts giving forgiveness right next to receiving forgiveness. So when Jesus taught the Lord's Prayer, He didn't say, Father, forgive me, and then I just move on with my day. It's, forgive me what I owe you while I'm paying attention to what I owe somebody else, and I'm making a choice, a commitment, a decision. I'm willing to also release them from their debt. And we don't have a lot of time to go through that handout, because that handout is literally, if we just went through it quickly, that's about a 2-hour process to go through that handout. But I would encourage you, go through the handout yourself and challenge yourself in terms of, am I doing this? First of all, am I doing it? Not just do I believe it, because we believe a lot of things we don't do. Am I doing this in terms of accepting God's forgiveness? All the ways you fall short. So there were moments when I resented going to see my dad. And I would feel bad about that. I resented going to take care of him. I got enough stuff to do down here in Texas. I have a family. I have a church. I have a counseling practice. And now I'm going to go spend several days a month somewhere else doing something else. And there were moments where I experienced genuine resentment over that. And I knew I need the uplift. I need the cleansing. I need the sense of rightness between me and God. That resentment has both been understood, because He does understand it, but it's also been paid for and forgiven. But here's another layer to this. And this is a more challenging layer. Because one of the things that Jennifer covered is the recognition that we talk in ways that aren't really accurate sometimes for a disease process. So sometimes when my dad was being combative, he was not being bad. He was living out in a very, to him, logical response to a scary situation. He was responding to something that looked a certain way to him. But he still said insulting things. He still sometimes hurt people. And your mom, your dad, whoever it is that you're taking care of, they could say really hurtful things. I think Jennifer asked for a show of hands. How many people have had someone say something hurtful to you while you're caring for them? Most of the hands in the room went up. And even if we don't want to call that behavior bad because we understand that it's flowing out of a disease process, for your heart and my heart, I really believe we still have to choose forgiveness. We still have to choose to let that go because we agree with God that it's forgiven. So we're not the source of forgiveness. We're just borrowing. So there's a passage in Ephesians 4 where he says, don't come up with your own forgiveness. Forgive each other in Christ Jesus as the Father has forgiven you. So I can't help but bring some of my pastor stuff into this. That I'm not just paying attention to God and I'm going to copy Him. It's I'm paying attention to God and I'm going to actually do it His way. That you and I have authority to receive forgiveness His way and then turn around and with His way in Christ forgive someone else. Now, here's one thing I also know is often true. And I felt very fortunate with my band of brothers, literally brothers. But many of you will experience this, where you're helping take care and you're giving 20, 30, 40, 70 hours or whatever to the care of this person. And your brother Bob sends you a check for $25 every week. Because, by golly, he wants to help. And so very often this issue of forgiveness means I need to forgive friends and family when they simply disappoint. When they fall short of what I needed or expected from them in this situation. Now, just really trying to cover a couple of things real quickly here. Take wise care of yourself. Get connected. And wise care of yourself means food, it means rest, it means spiritual nourishment and emotional nourishment that you're deciding, is there a way for me to just capture a few moments here or there? And this ends, I'm going to just jump to the last one. Celebrate, search for, look for, create opportunities to notice and enjoy sources of joy in your life. There's an event that happened in my life, or near my life, and then became a part of my life. A gentleman I knew in a Bible study many, many years ago was driving a friend to cancer treatments. His friend, I'll call him John, was suffering and dying from a brain tumor. And as they were there for treatment, the doctor asked John, he says, "Can I ask you a personal question?" John said, "Sure." And the doctor said, "We have healthy people in this room, in this facility. We have doctors and nurses and staff that are strong, healthy, successful. We have cancer patients that we can promise them in this treatment center, we're going to heal them. We can promise it. And all we can do is give you a few more weeks or a few more months, then this brain tumor will kill you. But John, you are the most joyful person in the building. What's that about?" And John stood up and put a dot on the wall. And he said, "That dot is my brain tumor. I know it's there, I can see it, I'm sad about it, and it's going to kill me." And he says, "But the whole rest of the wall are all the ways that God has loved me and blessed me through my lifetime. The whole rest of the wall is my wife and my children. And the whole rest of the wall is the eternity I believe I'm going to share with God, and that I believe my wife and children are going to share with me with God." And on and on. I don't know all the things he added to that list. Those are the only ones I remember. But then John said, "I'd be a fool to pretend the dot didn't exist. And that's why I have sadness." But he stood back and he said, "But I'd be a bigger fool to ignore the whole rest of the wall and pretend that the dot is the whole wall." And in my life, I have literally had hundreds of moments since that time, that I got through that moment a little bit wiser and a little bit better by remembering, Father, this is a dot. It's real and I got to deal with it and I don't like it, but it's a dot. And so that you and I are called and equipped, we have the freedom to keep finding more reasons for celebration in our life. More reasons for joy. A moment in another relationship. A memory, even of the person who's fading away, that we still treasure and celebrate. So I'm going to go ahead and end with that and open it up now for questions and answers if you have any. Am I on time with that? Okay.